So today we're going to be talking to Mr. Geek. I just got finished taking notes on his videos, so it'll be fresh on my mind. This is a conversation between him and Fang Podcast, or it might be called Fang Podcast. Of that much I'm not certain. So as soon as he hops in here, oh, he's in here. Okay, cool. We'll move him in. Whoops. I had to move Mr. Geek.
Here comes the money.
Here comes the money. What's going on? Let me check.
Really like your impact in this space and how you are helping people make better arguments.
Thanks, Peter Pants. Oh, okay. A smiley face. Thanks, Peter Pants off. You moved me back. Yeah, no, I jumped into the room with you. That was my bad. Let me move you back. Thank you so much for the $10. It's really cool. I'm happy that people appreciate the conversations. Okay, let's move you to Five Heads room. We're about to have another one of them right now, so I hope to show you with my actions that I care about that by continuing to do this. Thank you for your support. Okay, let's do this. Hi.
Hey, let me mute your stream.
Sure.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing good. Got a long stream today. By the way, yeah, I sent you the timestamp, but Dylan Burns went full Keikona.
Uh-oh.
That was funny.
On what?
On my stream, basically, we had a full InfoWars moment. That was really cool.
Huh, okay. I'll have to check that out then. Dylan Burns went crazy, huh?
Yeah, that was a funny moment.
Awesome. Okay, well, I'll check that out after for sure. So as far as this talk, we can start wherever you'd want. So what are you most interested in talking about first?
To be honest, it depends on you. Like, yeah. Like, what do you think we should start with?
Well, I wanted to start with wherever you might think was like problematic. Just because I'm not knowing for singing people's praises. So if we want to start with wherever you felt like you had some hiccups or you were confused or anything like that, we could start there.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I think it was a first debate, to be honest.
Hold on, I just pulled a fucking Tyler one.
I just saw that.
I spilled fucking... I was thinking about that as I was doing it too. Fuck. No. All right, that's fine. I guess we don't need those keys. We'll be good. Go on.
If you need to clean it, do it now. Like, yeah.
I think it's as clean as it's gonna get. I think I have to take off a few keys because it's when I press them, it squeezes up. So a few of them are probably Denskis. We're good.
Right.
let's
okay.
Restart. Okay, so could you start again? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no worries. So I think it was the first debate. Like, yeah, like for me, it was my first official debate in a formal, if I can say that, like basically formal context. Like, so yeah. I don't know. I think for me, there's two parts in this debate. There's the first part where we just basically throw data at each other, which I think was pointless. And the second part, I felt more comfortable. Basically, I think I made some better arguments. Anyway, what do you think?
When do you think the second part started?
Basically, when we start talking about culture, basically when we drop the talking about data and stuff like that. Basically, when we stop throwing statistics and numbers and sources at each other.
Okay. And if you were to say like what percentage into the conversation that happened, where would you put that?
I think it was the last 40% of the conversation, basically.
Okay.
I don't have a timestamp, like.
I mean, you're good if you don't have timestamps and stuff. So to kind of like give you a quick snapshot of what my notes look like,
Hmm.
Highlights in green are you, and highlights in pink are him. And I went through the whole thing, and then in the margin, every time I hit a new line, I try to keep track of what the timestamps are. So I have like a whole outline of the entire conversation, and it looks like you guys talk about statistics and percentages all the way up until the very end. So that's why I thought that was interesting.
Oh. Um. Okay.
Like one of the last points that you have, and it's when you kind of start to like make some give him some ground on the final point. You're telling him stuff like yeah, I guess I would agree that it's not 0%, but it would be relatively insignificant and stuff like that. So you guys do kind of stay grounded in that the entire time. Although I would agree that like the way that you guys were having a back and forth with statistics and studies was really like I don't know, interesting. I have like I don't know. I would like to say because I like you more that he was being stubborn, but
I was too.
I mean maybe, but I mean you in my opinion you were responding better to like the specifics that he was implying through his studies, and you seem to be more interested in giving him like extra footholds in the conversation so you could take it in any number of directions, whereas like his responses to your statistics or your studies were fairly like pointed, and they just like brought up another statistic or something else without giving you many other like directions to go with it. Like a lot of the time it was like, oh yeah, I've read this study, the people that researched it actually said this, and then you had to sit there and go through it and go, yeah, but they also say this, which seems to be in support of my idea. And then it's like, oh yeah, that part's definitely in support of your idea. I just think we could categorize this as something else. And then it was like constantly trying to see like, okay, I'm going to reinterpret your source in a way that I can find my thing, and then vice versa. Like that's where the back and forth was like exactly the same, as you both were looking at them from your own perspective. But I mean, like with him, it seemed more irritating just because I think there was less places he was allowing you to go in his responses. But yeah, I like it's tough to say either of you did anything wrong or whatever. That's why it's tough to ask me like what my advice would be, because I'm not sure. It would depend on where you felt like you tripped up or where you were struggling.
I don't know. I think first of all, this is really interesting because yeah, like I didn't get the. I don't know. When I think about it, I didn't get like the same impression you're having. Basically, I really felt like there was two parts in the conversation. Like the first part was really like pure numbers, like pure like here's my source about that claim. And him going here's my source about that claim, and I don't know. It felt really like, for lack of better word, tone deaf. Basically.
Okay.
It felt like we were throwing shit. Sorry, we were throwing like he was on one side of a wall, I was on the other, and we were throwing like statistics. Not even over the wall, but like in the wall. You know, like
Yeah.
I don't know. There was a wall, and I wasn't able to reach out. Basically, I felt like this was a big failure from my part. Like to be able to analyze what he was saying. I don't know. I felt like I wasn't really addressing his point.
Okay. Like the thing was there was, and I have this when I talk to Dan about too. There's this kind of like if you look underneath the surface and you try to pick out like a bigger thing, like it's almost like putting your head into like a big like lake of water or whatever, and then every so often you see like a really big fish swim past. But like the odds of you ever no, never mind. I'm not going to be complicated about it. So the only times that he gave you some insight into like his larger argument where you could have actually made any forward progress was when he dropped little hints about like he had a line where he said you're saying that this is a top-down problem, and I'm just trying to say that I think it's a bottom-up problem, and we have to solve it that way. But it was like a super brief thing, and I think it was like while you were talking, and I was like, oh, there it is. That's like the actual belief. Like that's what we actually have to talk about. Like that's where your contention is you're saying this is a whole top-down thing that basically like the police institution is suffering from systemic racism, and from his perspective, that looks like you're saying it's a top-down problem, and he really wants to say that it's a bottom-up, that like everybody has these implicit biases, and it's just a collection of like the fact that everybody has them and everybody makes up the police department, that of course the police department would be just as biased as everybody else, and that if you're actually to find a proper way to compare how biased they are in their jobs versus like other forms of bias in other jobs, you would find that like, oh no, there's definitely just like a low-key maybe current of bias that everybody has. And so it's almost like he's trying to say, well, it's not specific to the police department. This is like a people problem, and I want to give approaches that are like people-centric. But like he never really gets to flesh it out like that. He never tries to. The whole beginning of the conversation, maybe up until about 42 minutes, is all just like source responding with the source, responding with the source, responding with the source. It isn't until later that when you guys are talking about other stuff that he starts to ask some questions that are more abstract. Like when he's getting into stuff like, okay, well, like theoretically, if stop and frisk can actually like prevent crime, and even if it hit a bunch of people that were innocent, I would think that's okay. And you were like, well, I definitely don't think that's okay, and I think that can lead to like if that's the bar that we set, we're gonna have a lot of other like problematic policing behaviors. Like we're just gonna like arrest everybody, and like because eventually you'll catch people that do crimes, or you'll dissuade people from committing crimes, and like it's a slippery slope. And then he like immediately points out before you're able to that it's a slippery slope, and like yada yada yada, it goes on from there. But at the points where he asks these more broad questions and you are able to respond more broadly, that's when you guys are actually able to move forward, not when you were talking about the statistics, which kind of made up the whole first part of the conversation for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
But like statistics are still prevalent throughout the entire thing, and so are the references, especially on his part. Like one of the most important sources he had that I don't feel like you were able to respond to necessarily like properly, but he didn't do a good job of explaining why you weren't, is the dog statistic thing, where he's saying like, well, the dogs can't possibly be racist, and you got into it a little bit where you're like, well, like, this doesn't control for what they were pulled over for. So at the end of the day, this doesn't tell us anything either, because, like, if the cops are, and you didn't extend it this far, but the extra thing to say would have been, like, if the cops are pulling over for racist reason and they employ the dog, like, you're going to see the percentage reflected not because of the dog and its decisions, but like the decisions of the officers which led to these stops. So like the buck doesn't stop at the dog, it kind of stops at the officer, and the dog is like a tool of the police. So like, yeah, of course you're going to catch me here if you try to get me to say that the dogs are racist. That's silly. But like, you're failing to notice that like the dog is a tool that's employed by the police, and like the reason for the stop is probably important to know. And to be fair to you, you did that on a few other statistics and studies in here. You were very good at cutting through to like, yes, but they also say this, or like, yeah, but the researcher right here says this, and like not letting him get away when it was difficult to find that. Because there were a few points where he tries to pivot away, and he successfully does on other points, but you keep up that like level of scrutiny over his sources pretty well. That was a big ramble. Any of that stick, or any questions, or?
Yeah. The only thing I want to say is that basically after this debate, I was like, I don't know, it did. Like as soon as it was done, I was like, oh damn, I should have said that. And you just added to this list, because this is a great argument you made about the police dogs. So yeah, I'm going to mold over this a lot more now. Thank you for that.
No problem.
No, yeah, I agree with you. Like I said, I feel like it was a first debate. I feel I was trying to be too polite, in my opinion. Like I let some things go just by politeness, because I felt like my answer would have been too direct or too aggressive.
Yeah. But I mean, like, I think that, okay, so this is something that came up in the conversation with Pixie too, is like, I think for the people that are softer communicators or like are looking to keep the tension of the conversation low, I think that that's a fine thing to do. And I think it's actually a really productive strategy. And you achieve that by not being so critical or not being super direct. And I think that it's like a line that you walk. And I think it's preferable to try to do that actually. I know that's not advice that like other people will give necessarily, but I actually agree that keeping the tension of the conversation low, even at the cost of like not addressing every single thing you disagree with, is probably for the best. Like,
Okay.
if you're interested, we could go through some like things that he said that could have been like avenues of argument, or we could go any direction you really want.
Yeah, give me some stuff to mold about.
Okay. Let's see here. So he constantly is alluding to this distinction between implicit bias and systemic bias, right? Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Because at least up until about 30 some minutes into the conversation, that's mostly what it seems like you guys are arguing about. Like he's trying to make a distinction in the kinds of bias by referring to the dog study, by referring to how we need to control for like the crimes, and by talking about implicit bias and saying that like, well, if your experience is this and those people do more, that's going to reflect in your behavior. Like all of this outlining that he's doing for implicit bias is supposed to stand in stark contrast to your description of systemic bias. Now, I don't know where the miscommunication was on seeing how similar those two ideas are. Like, it's really tough to say from listening to the conversation because you guys don't get into the abstract until the later half of the conversation. But it was really weird, and I think it was weird for the chatters too, if I'm remembering correctly, because they were like, "Wait, hold on, what do you mean?" My biggest like yikes moment and the turning point of the conversation, kind of shortly after, was he said something like. Let's see, pro-analysis data does not support. Yeah, he's saying stuff like the data is actually not supporting an implicit bias. It's actually supporting, or it's not supporting a freaking systemic bias. It's supporting an implicit bias. And like, it made it clear that he's not, like, his distinction between these two things is completely unwarranted, and it's probably not very like academic in nature. Like, it's weird. It's an amalgam of other things that he's heard, and like pinning him down on that and forcing him to like make these distinctions between systemic and implicit would have brought out this top bottom versus bottom top reform idea really quickly. Because actually shortly after this, he briefly mentions that, and it's like a passing remark, but like for me, I would have like stopped the whole conversation and been like, whoa, okay, top bottom versus bottom top, let's talk about that, because like that's not necessarily what I'm saying. Like, at least this is my assumption about your positions. You're not saying that like this is a problem of all of the leadership in the police training all of their guys to be like bad in all of their training and their tactics. Like, that's not really where you're saying that bias is coming from, right?
Yeah.
And like, and so I think if you were able to pick up on that way quicker, that like, wait, I'm not saying that this is like a top bottom problem at all. Like, I'm under no illusion that like the tactics and higher level officials are the ones in majority like responsible for this behavior. Like, I would agree it's a societal problem. And like, then you could have drawn agreement later when he starts talking about the possible effects of rap music, which in my personal opinion, you argued against like maybe too hard. Like, it would have been an easy concession to just be like, well, it's definitely influential, but not to that extent, which is what you ended up saying before you guys had your final bit of agreement when you said it's not 0%, but it's, insignificant insofar as like what you're trying to attribute to it. Like, obviously it's going to affect people and their behavior or whatever, but it's not causing them to go out and commit acts of violence against the police. I wouldn't go that far.
Yeah, the reason because the reason why I argue this point so hard is because I I've had this conversation before, and I know how it goes. Basically, like I know that people are starting with saying like rap culture is violent and anti-cops, and soon they will like start adding stuff to their definition of culture,
I mean, they
and
might
basically
be.
giving a little bit of ground on this is extremely dangerous, in my opinion.
Okay. Do you view giving any ground in the argument to be kind of like a negative thing overall for you?
Um, it depends on the argument. I don't mind, like, I don't know. I feel like some arguments, yeah, the cultural argument, yeah, I don't know if I could give any ground on that.
Because I think that there are like rhetorical losses to be had from a failure to concede like basic points. So even if, and this is something that I kind of touched upon with Dario, even if you can see like 5 or 6 steps ahead and you're like, wait, this is going in a direction I totally don't want to go down. I think that like at the same time you have to temper that with like what it'll look like if you avoid to like confront this. So eventually he started posing like increasingly broad scenarios to you, and you continue to reject them outside of the outside of the context of the argument because it was clear like when he starts talking about a dad, and okay, but you would agree a dad is influential, and you're like begrudgingly like yes, and it's like okay, well why? Oh, because of this and this. You're very like careful about it. I really think way before that you could have easily just conceded this part of it, and then if it continues to go in that direction then you could stop it, but this was like over an hour in, so at that point too, yeah, I mean we're towards the end. And he was being pretty good faith throughout the rest of it, I would say. He definitely had his perspective that he was focused on for a lot of it, but I would say towards the end he was kind of letting up a lot and more willing to work in the abstract instead of his studies. Although I think that's in part due to like him not being able to use those studies super well.
Yeah, because every study he can found will go against his point.
Mm-hmm.
And that, yeah.
And so, if that was the case, and you still wanted to avoid this, and you disagree with me about the negativities with not conceding that, you could have always brought it back to the studies and stuff too. Like if you find that now people are moving into the abstract just so that they can gain some ground on you, you can always like bring it back to the studies and just like no, I'm gonna beat you here. Like, do you see any like clear ways in this conversation how you could have done that, or should I go through a few?
Yeah, if you can go through a few, that would be great.
So the very first thing I would say is we needed to not have given him this little bit of ground. So in the very middle of the conversation, this is where we have like a complete change in direction and tone. You actually say, and I quote, statistics does not mean anything. And then he kind of really picked up on that. And then you started to go in an abstract direction from there. But I think like that was the moment where you turned the conversation into something else, whether like you meant to or not, because you were kind of giving off that vibe too towards the end of it. But that's because you're getting fatigued with the study thing, and it was getting annoying, especially when you had the upper hand. But I think recognizing you had the upper hand and keeping it there probably would have been best. You could have done stuff like, let's see what he responds to that right after. He says, oh, okay, yeah. So he gives you some ground that you could have jumped on right before that, where he's saying that what you need to prove to me here is that black people are, as a group, are being disproportionately affected more than other groups. So people with long hair, people that are tall, people that are short. This is another argument that he's clearly gotten from somebody else and is not employing very well here. And that would have been a good place to continue in the statistical conversation and go, well, hold on. So like, explain to me what kind of statistics I would need to show you to prove this, because as far as I understand, like, that's not the topic of any of the experts that I've read, and nobody is putting forth the idea that, like, we need to control for this bias by looking at people with long hair or black hair or whatever. So are there some more specific examples you can use from other studies that have controlled for this? Because I'm not sure if he had that, because it's something that doesn't support his opinion, and he doesn't seem like someone who's read much into the other side of things. So I think that would have been a good direction to go. Really anything where you put him on the spot of having to statistically or through data prove the other side would have been really good, because you saw that, like, his argument was built upon a bunch of sources and stuff that I think he's at least in part getting from other people, or he doesn't seem to understand super well or like intuitively himself. So bringing him outside of that, where he should be in the best condition, and bringing him over to your side and having him argue from that perspective actually, like, would probably hurt him a lot. The only worry I would have is if you weren't able to do the same thing, but I think you could have. Yeah. How about that? Would that be possible, or does that sound outlandish?
I would have to work on that. Like, I would have to rewatch the debate with basically your stream open on the side and basically go over this and think about, like, yeah. Yeah, basically I'm not used to function like that. And it's, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, he gave you a lot of signs that he was uncomfortable stating his position from the very beginning too, which is like something I picked up on very quickly, and I think you were feeling towards the end of the statistic thing. That's an assumption of mine, but like the conversation starts out with him asking you, like, oh, where are you looking and like what the data says, and then you ask him and you say, well, actually, like I think to start, I'm curious about like what your position here is, and like I've seen you on this other stream, and then he asks you the exact same thing back to you, and then you kind of go into the basics, and you're like, well, racism obviously exists, and there, let's see here. There can be in the system without being racist. Oh, okay, and then he says the system. Okay, and then you're like, yes, I think there's like systemic racism exists, and I think that that's obviously going to impact the police department. And then he says that I don't think systemic racism exists in the police department. And then you ask him why specifically, and then and then we start the study fight. And he only has really 3 like key studies. He has his dog study, he has his nationwide study, and then he has like one other one, which I think was in some kind of response to yours. And he kind of just cycles through those the entire time. Like, he references the dog study like 5 times, but it wasn't helping him at all. He references the nationwide study to trump every single study you had on a smaller population. And like, that was annoying. And I think you could have pushed back on a little bit more as well. Could you see ways in hindsight that you could have pushed back on that, like the use of a nationwide study to discredit your smaller studies?
I would say, like, let's say for the same, basically, like the first the first thought I have about that is basically that not all states are equal when it comes to this. So yeah, you're going to have states that are going to balance everything. So yeah, watching at national studies isn't a good thing, and I'm going to mod so hard, even harder after your conversation than after the debate. But yeah. But to be honest, here's the thing, and I discussed with Supreme about this, the beta launch. I think that the format, like basically throwing studies at each other is so stupid, because yeah, I'm not going to review every number that is in this study like live. I'm not going to take 1 hour to just scroll through a study to find numbers, analyze numbers, see the method used to get together those data. So yeah, I think I don't know. if I had to add another debate with the Fang podcast, I will ask him basically to provide his study before the podcast, basically, and I will provide mine.
Okay. So like submitting evidence to the court beforehand kind of deal, where like you can review each other's sources that you plan to use, or
Yeah, exactly.
okay. Yeah, I mean, you could try that. If that ends up working, that would be cool. Like if he agrees to it, but if he doesn't, then that kind of puts you in the same position you were in before.
Yeah, in that case, I wouldn't go over that. I would go over like basically broad arguments and get some data around those arguments, basically, and not base all of my argumentation around data.
Yeah, I mean that's probably good. Like diversifying the arguments that you could probably do. And if you end up going down that route, my advice would be to like quickly track and figure out like what those broader arguments for him, so you know like what you're kind of arguing against, so you have like a more clear picture. I'm finding that a lot of the people that are debating are somehow not taking notes too, so if that's your situation, I would suggest taking notes as well. Because then like if you feel like the conversation is going in a weird direction, like you were saying before about like the questions he's starting to ask or like the concessions he's looking for could lead to like a bad road of an argument. If you had all the notes about what he believed in front of you, you could just ask him for agreement on all the previous stuff that you were talking about, and that might diffuse or redirect the conversation. So you could go, okay, hold on, because I think we're going in like a really weird direction here. Let me just like confirm some basic things that like I'm assuming about your position, and then go through the notes that you've been taking on his position, get his agreement on stuff, and then at the end of that, take it in the direction you want to take it. So take a moment to pause and then go forward in a more productive direction that's different than the one at the very beginning, like the weird direction that he wanted to take it with like race stuff or whatever. Like in this conversation, you said it was like giving ground on like rap influencing culture. So if he starts going in a direction like that, reading back all of his stuff to him, getting agreement, and then taking it in a wholly different direction is a good way to get out of that.
Okay.
And it works better for soft spoken or like people that are looking for agreement too. So like this was also something that I gave Pixie as like a good way of getting out of like tricky situations. Or like if the conversation has suddenly come to a point where you're like, wait, what the fuck are we talking about? Or like, oh no, I see where this is going. Like, how do I stop this? That's a good way to do it.
Yeah, this is why I say it's a first debate, because I feel like this is the type of thing that will come with time, basically. With yeah.
Yeah. Let's see here.
Can I ask you, like, what did you think about, like, because, okay, what did you think about basically the whole culture part, like when we start talking about music and stuff like that? Do you have more to add to this?
Read a book, read a book, read a motherfucking book. Read a book, read a book, read a motherfucking book. Read a book, read a book, read a motherfucking book.
If you don't, that's okay. It's just.
Oh, I'm just reading back the conversation.
R-E-A-D-A-B-O-O-K. R-E-A-D-A-B-O-O-K. R-E-A-D-A-B-O-O-K.
Oh, okay. So in that last part, you said something really good that he ends up agreeing with at the very end, but you guys talk about this for like 15 minutes straight, and you had the answer right at the beginning. So he suggests that you guys move on after he gets his ass kicked on the statistics stuff, and then basically he starts going down that direction of like, do you think that the black media influencing people is actually like part of the problem between like the relationship between the police and whatever, or that because he doesn't even reference violence at the very beginning of it too, and then you immediately respond like, well, that seems like a chicken and egg scenario, but you don't get the opportunity to explain the bits that are convincing of that argument. So like it isn't until later that you actually get to like fully flesh out the idea that like what you have to realize is that these are stories of people that grew up in these places, and that like these people are oftentimes victims of this system and of this thing that I'm trying to convince you of. And that's reflected in their music. That's reflected in their lyrics. That's reflected in, African American culture more broadly. And it's a chicken and the egg thing for sure, but I would say for all of these rappers, they're pointing to an experience that people connect with, and it's precisely because of this like oppression that we're talking about, or the systemic like issue that we have. I think he could vibe with that too. And then you guys could start talking about, okay, so what about when I say systemic is upsetting you? And he could start to explain that top-down thing. Or you could start to say like, okay, what is the difference between systemic and cultural? Because you seem to be well aware that like cultural influences change the behavior of people and impact the relationships between like authorities and the communities that they police. So like, if you're aware of that, like what is the difference between that and like the systemic problems that come as a result of that? And like that therein lies like the big question about like the difference in your positions, right? Because he's just not making that next leap from saying these implicit biases, which are so common in American culture, are like he admits that that's the cause of this police thing, but it's like, okay, so how come you can't make the extra leap to say then, okay, well, if this is at all levels, then that's a systemic problem and we have to handle it as such. We need to put in changes in the system, whether that's through training or whatever, to like, rein in that behavior and make it unacceptable and like remove it as much as possible from like the outcomes for communities. And I think that was like the big spot that I wish that the conversation was able to move to more. And you immediately get it with the chicken and egg thing, but then he leads you on a wild goose chase, no pun intended, for like another like 15 minutes before the end. And then the shitty thing is he ends it by basically saying that like, well, this sounds like a chicken and the egg problem, huh? Whatever, we'll talk to you later. It's like, no, that's what Geek said though. That's not fair. Like it looks like he's the one randomly coming up with that idea at the end, and I was like, no, Geek said that like in the very beginning of this entire thread of the conversation, but like because you didn't focus on it and because you immediately identified that this argument could go a direction that you didn't want it to go, you were very averse to it. And instead of like focusing on like the chicken and egg thing, you were focusing on like, shit, like where is he going with this and how do I like get out of this? And you were very like combative with the idea rather than like, yeah, I get what you're saying. Like, I agree that they are having an influence, but my question is like, how are you drawing the start and stop of that? Like, how are you saying that like the buck stops with the rappers? Like, where did the rappers get these ideas from? Like their personal experiences, and like, then we go in a big loop of it. Like, so constantly bringing it back to that analogy of the chicken and the egg probably would have shortened that last part.
Yeah, that's a good. I don't know. I feel like I made that point, but maybe not as clearly, basically. Thinking that...
because immediately responding to him saying that the black media are at least partly responsible for this, you say it's a chicken and the egg problem, and you immediately combine that in the same exact point with music doesn't make people violent. And he immediately was going to take issue with that because it's just a matter of like what percent you can attribute to it, but it's for sure not zero. So he's going to continue to argue that because that seems to be how his brain works too. He's approaching everything like uber logically. So if you have a logical inconsistency like that, he's going to jump onto it and attack it because you're saying it's not, instead of saying like it's not the biggest or even not including that point at all. If you would have just said it's a chicken and the egg problem and explained the culture part of it, I think it may very well have stopped right there, to be honest.
Yeah, sure.
Because he ends up saying the chicken and the egg thing after you give your final concession in the last like 2 minutes of the conversation, saying, well, it's not 0%, but it's insignificant for what you're attributing it to. And then that's when he goes, sure, whatever. And then he goes with the chicken and the egg thing. And then and then the conversation basically ends. So yeah, that was unfortunate. But like, it's tough to say. I don't know. I don't think like I think what you said before about avoiding the back and forth with the studies by going to a broader level more quickly is definitely possible. But I think also that like seeing how somebody responds to studies and like the actions that they take to have that conversation give you a lot of insight into like how they're approaching the argument. Like he was constantly refuting every single thing you were giving, and it was on the basis of like controlling for stuff, and it was on the basis of like what the researchers are saying and like stuff like that. And that's a very like I don't want to, like you said, I don't want to check through every fucking thing in real time and have to do that. Like, so that would best be done at the beginning. And I would agree that's like a red flag about engaging with somebody about stats and studies and stuff. And he tried also to like worry you off by saying things like, oh, I've read this one. Oh, yeah, this is that one. Oh, yeah, I've read this one. And it's like, yeah, but it doesn't seem so, because then when he asks you a bunch of questions about it, you don't seem to realize that this is like visibly counter to your argument and in a lot of different ways.
And sometimes something that I've like a thing that I found really frustrating about this conversation is that sometimes he will concede the point and just like hand wave it. Like he will look to a study, say, okay, it says that, and it refutes my point, but and not even like answering to this, not even trying to respond to this, but like switching to like moving on basically. And I don't know. Yeah, I feel like I was a little bit too passive. But to be honest, I like talking with you about this because we have such a completely different analysis of what happened. Like for me, the first part about the statistic was where I failed. And I feel like I did better on the last part. And for you, I feel like this is the complete reverse.
Yes, but like as far as where I see room for improvement, I see more room for improvement in the last part than I do the first part. I actually think you handled those criticisms of your studies really, really well, and you were very much so like on your toes about that. I get that like how it comes off, like how long it took you to do your responses and stuff was longer. And like a couple of them, you did like trip over your words, but I don't want to fault people for like rhetoric stuff like that. Like that's kind of, that is what it is. And it's not like the biggest problem of everything here. Like I really think you did handle all those criticisms of your studies really well. And like you said, he was forced to concede in a lot of places, but did it nonchalantly enough, and you let him off the hook enough to where they didn't have quite the same impact that they could have if you chose to be mean about it. Like, I think at a few points, I think you still would have been in the clear to like give him more shit about being wrong on some stuff. Like, especially when like when he starts to try to change tact and he's asking you more broad questions, you kind of hung on to your statistics for a little bit. Like when you guys start talking about that study that said 86% of people basically didn't have anything when they were stop and frisked, like that was a good fucking study. And like the fact that he kept engaging with it and engaged with it for so long before discrediting it based on its sample size, it made him sound ridiculous. And like when you were pointing out the 85% thing and he just responds with, okay, cool, and then is able to move topics, I was like, no, Geek, fucking put him on blast. No, he's escaping. That's so awful. And then he drops the, yeah, but there's a nationwide study that actually does this. And like, your study only covers millions of fucking people. Like, come on, dude. Come on, really? And then you don't call him out on it because, I assume because you're being nice. But I'm like, dude, if that was fucking Dario, he would rip this motherfucker apart. 80, like, oh man, come on. When we're talking about millions of people, like, yeah, but my nationwide one that doesn't control for shit because you can't when it's that big, like, come on. And you're going to give me shit for controlling all my studies? Like, get out of here. And then you prove him wrong every single time he does it, where it's like, no, it actually does. And it says it controls for that here. And actually, your study doesn't control for that here. And it's like, yikes. This just looks completely yikes. If Mr. Geek was meaner, this would be like a bloodbath in the very beginning. That's why I'm not giving you criticism on the beginning, because that's my honest take on it, is I think you actually handled that super well. And if anything, I would say be meaner. But like, you know.
Okay, noted. Yeah, I felt like I said, I felt like the reason why I didn't answer to that and I didn't address like his nationwide numbers is that basically I don't want to hand wave it. Basically, I want to check the numbers and come back to it, which is not possible to like in this format. Basically, I couldn't stop, go through the numbers. Like, yeah, I don't know. So yeah, that was a failure for me. But I try to be meaner in the future.
Oh man, and like, so if we want to talk about a place where you could have made a broad argument based on like the rope this guy was giving you, like there's one where he says, bias isn't racist, just implicit based on traits. Like, whoa, well, hold on. What do you think race is? Like, that's such a confusing way of wording that. What do you mean the bias isn't racial? It's just based on physical traits. Like, yeah, the physical traits that we attribute to race. Like, what a silly thing to say. Like, there were a few points like that where it's just like, I don't know. Anywho, I'm ranting at this point.
Yeah, it was the first debate.
Yeah. I like I said, I think the first part was totally fine. I think the last part, the only frustrating thing was not conceding what I think would have been like an okay point to concede based on how the first half went. But you know, unless you have any other questions, I mean, that's basically my take on it. I agree you can divide it into a first half and a last half, but he definitely still kept reaching for studies even in the last half. Like he references nationwide study all the way up until the end. And he actually referenced other studies based on like video games and stuff like that until like the last few minutes.
Yeah, and the study, like, I don't know if you noticed, but the study he talked about, like, he basically brought up this study and directly followed this by, yeah, but this study was proved to be false. So, yeah, I don't know. Like...
Yeah, like the video game studies, it said that they obviously don't cause violence in support of your position, which is that music causes violence. Like, this is a weird argument, dude. And it's like, I think the audience could agree with his point, but like when he made those arguments for it, it's like, well, that's a weird way to argue that point. I think the audience is on your team generally. Like, obviously music influences people, and obviously rappers constantly shitting on the police is going to lead to people that are more likely to shit on police. I don't think that's like controversial, but like then the way he argues it is like cringe. I just think it's tough
Even
to
you
quantify.
saying that, I want to debate you on that, but no.
Well, like, I think it's insignificant, like you said, but it's definitely not zero. It's definitely part of like a larger, like, the way that we culturally raise people and the influences and whatever. Like, it's way tough to pin 1-to-1 that like this act of violence was for sure caused 22% because of this rap song that this dude liked. Like, there's no way you're ever going to be able to do that. So it's kind of like a moot point to bring up, but it definitely does contribute to a culture that is more suspicious of and has worse relationships with the police. But like you said, it's a chicken and the egg thing. Are you going to blame the rappers for that? Or are you going to blame like the police that created the experiences for them to sing about later? Like, you know, like, where does the buck stop there? That's why it's not helpful, but it's definitely pointing to a truth. Like, you know, in the same way that people like him arguing that statistically if black people commit the things, then we should just call it implicit and be done with it, whatever. It's like, you know, like the same way everything influences everything. Like, it's just it's a weird moot point to make. And that's why I think conceding it doesn't really do a lot of damage. Because, like, later you say, like, you know, like, about rock and roll and other stuff and how it's, like, constantly proven that these things have just very little impact, even if, like, culturally they're very prevalent. Like, you know, it's a chicken and the egg. Are you going to say that rock music caused a bunch of, like, the counterculture revolution and whatever? Or are you going to say that that was, like, part and parcel to, like, the conditions at that time that made that come up? Like, that's super hard. It's a weird cultural question that I don't think either of you would be able to, like, go through unless you were God. So, you know, it's like way hard to argue. It's a weird place to go.
Yeah, I think that's something I am gonna need to work on. Basically, I'm trying to identify which hill is good to die on. Because I was ready at this point to die on the music hill.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. Yeah. I just thought that chicken the egg response was really fucking good. That would have been the direction I would have liked to have taken it, because I do think that that's a good way of putting it. But then you guys went in a different direction. I was like, no. Then it was like, well, would you agree that the president's tweets influence people? And you're like, yeah. And I'm like, no, this is like going in a weird direction. Like, uh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, I get what you're saying. I think I'm going to review like the debate with your analysis on the side because, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And if and after rewatching it, you want to talk about it again, or you have any contentions or further questions or anything like that, I'm happy to do it because I actually took really, really good notes this time. So I should be able to I should be capable of doing this again. Sorry, I'm all discombobulated.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, maybe I don't know. Maybe if I have like I say, I need to review the debate. I didn't want to because I feel like I was going to mold even more, but after tonight, I'm going to mold. So no matter what, so yeah.
And if it's any consolation, I really think you did good in the part that you didn't give yourself much credit for. Like, I thought you were really on your toes responding to the criticisms about your studies. Like, even with like the tripping over your words and stuff, you were very quick on finding like what you needed to find in those studies. And that's something that a lot of people struggle to do on the fly. So I actually think props to you on the whole first half of this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I'm gonna have to rewatch this with a new angle because yeah. But yeah, to be honest, like Prime Kai helped me a lot doing my legwork on this, like finding studies and stuff like that. Because being in France is super hard for me to find studies in English that doesn't talk about the UK. So he helped me a lot to find studies and stuff like that. So I had everything ready, basically. I had like every argument in my head. I had like, so yeah, I was, so yeah, other things considered, yeah, I think you're right about the study thing.
Awesome. Yeah. And if you ever want to talk about that music and culture thing, I'm happy to have that conversation too.
Yeah, I debate you to death on this.
Okay.
I'd be Mina.
I'd appreciate it. I'll welcome it. Awesome. All right. Well, I'll talk to you later, Mr. Geek, unless you have any last questions or anything.
No, thanks for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
Oh, shout yourself out. I'm so sorry. I'm bad at etiquette.
Yeah, twitch.tv/Mr. Geek. I do video editing and a lot of Photoshop work on stream. I also debate, like, yeah, I try to. I had a really good one today. Well, I almost
good.
like, my brain kind of die in the middle, but that's okay.
Mr.
Yeah,
Geek is also
and-
like a really good community member. He's really good at like staying positive and reaching out to like smaller streamers and helping them out with stuff. And like you've been really on top of things like behind the scenes. So that's not something you can give yourself credit for, but I'll take the second to do that. Like you're really, really kind and like helpful and all that kind of stuff too.
Thanks, I appreciate it. And you know that if you need anything, you know where to find me.
Yep. I'll put the I put the yellow flag emote that you did up. So like now we have a yellow flag emote, guys. So check that out. That's courtesy of Mr. Geek.
All right.
Awesome. I'll talk to you later.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
I was happy that like there were a lot of positives in this conversation. Like I get that the beginning to maybe a viewer seemed like a constant back and forth of studies, which it was, and that's not necessarily like something that people enjoy, but I enjoyed it because I was able to see how Mr. Geek was like navigating that. Like the criticisms that were being made of his studies during it, like how it was controlling for stuff, the background of the researchers, why statistically it's not as good as something else. Like all of these are questions that can be really difficult for people to address, especially in real time. Like if somebody asked you a very pointed question about controls in a study, what I find, at least working even with grad students, is that is not their first instinct to check in a study. And I've enjoyed seeing Dario and other people talk more about this, but like for debate and for argument, like you should definitely look at how they're controlling for things, and you should definitely read the methodology. Um, Unfortunately, even for grad students, they do not like reading that. They are abstract readers. They read only the abstracts, and you will miss out stuff like this. And there's a lot of embarrassing things that could be hidden in the methodology section. So if you don't check that and you're citing a source, like, just know that the more you do that, the more you leave yourself open to attacks that you don't see coming because you didn't properly read your sources. So that's just a tidbit of advice for anybody that wants to do Twitch arguing and stuff, is that especially if you're going up against like debate bro type of people, they will criticize your sources. And if they choose to and you didn't, prepare for that, that could be ugly. Hi, Aiko. It's good to see you here. So yeah, that's one thing to consider. But like I said, Geek did fantastic with that. He handled all of that really well. He responded like, grace with grace to every single one of those. When they were silly, he was able to debunk them for the most part, other than the nationwide thing that that person kept pointing at. I think Geek's response to him in so much as saying like New York would be important or whatever, it wouldn't have been the way I would have approached it. I probably would have been like, well, hold on, you said some dumb shit about like how this is millions and millions of people and it's not as valuable as your study, which is uber duper broad. Like this is because I'm talking about this specific policy and how we can look at this specific policy to see examples of this problem, because my purpose here is to look at the problem. But you pointing to this larger thing that's not controlling for shit and doesn't have any sort of purpose, and like the fact that that's not painting the picture is like, I don't know, it's not helpful to your argument in the way that you think it is. And so I would focus on that. But yeah, like I said, he handled all that super well. Towards the end, I just think not giving ground on that final point, not giving ground on the idea that like music has a cultural influence on people that can be difficult to measure. Like just giving that should have been fine. But like he said, he saw several steps ahead and was concerned about the direction that giving concessions there could result in. Like he also said towards the end of our conversation, that was the hill that he chose to die on, and maybe in the future he'll think about like which hills to die on. And I think that's actually a good way of putting it, because for sure, if you're able to see that a conversation is going in a certain way, I think it's fine to pick a hill to die on and to just like argue that out and not give ground on it. I just don't know if this was the point to do that. And I think because it was so deep into the conversation and we kind of had an idea for the person he's talking to all throughout it, that like it probably wouldn't have been too big of a deal. Although it's in the cultural direction and not actually in the direction of talking about studies and statistics and whatever that they started in. So it's like a whole different realm to be dealing with that person. I'm not sure if what we learned in one would carry over to the other. But anywho, that was my talk with Mr. Geek. I'm currently, to update you guys, working on the Pixie talk. I have downloaded that today. Hopefully in the next 2 or 3 days, I'll be able to add all of my notes on top of it. One thing I did with the Chud Logic talk, which if you missed it, definitely check it out because I actually edited it, so you'll get more out of it. When I'm talking to people, oftentimes there's one or two things that are like on the forefront of my brain, like a couple of questions I want to answer or things I'm trying to address or things I think are important, maybe even things that I'm listening for. And then there's the rhetoric, right? There's the decisions that I make about the way I word stuff that can be really important and people seem interested to hear about. So in the talk with Chud Logic, I went ahead and added a bunch of notes on the bottom with why I'm making the rhetorical choices that I am, notes on the top with context about whatever it is that we're talking about, and then more notes at the top for like at one point he lists some problems that he's having with panels, and I, on my notes in front of me, have those listed as like the 3 biggest things that I need to make sure all of the solutions that I propose hit those, right? And that's not clear to you guys in the live conversation. And that's not even clear if I just straight up upload the video. So to make it more clear, I've added that into the video. I've edited it on top with text so that you can tell those things in real time. So I think that adds like another level to the YouTube that'll actually make it better to consume in the future. Since the beginning, Mr. Geek says, since the beginning of the BLM movement, as a French dude who can't go to protests and stuff, I decided to focus on how to defend stuff like 1350. I had similar discussions, and this quote-unquote culture argument is brought up a lot, and people load this term to the death, and I felt like if I gave ground on this, he could have loaded the term even more. Yeah, for sure. That's what I was telling them with, like, you're seeing a few steps ahead in the argument, but like the reason why I'm not wording this specifically in all the words you used, and I'm wording it as like you're looking a few steps ahead in the conversation, is because that's your guess about where it's going to go. But yeah, because the problem is I'm making that guess in this scenario, and making that guess and then cutting it there probably wasn't the best point to cut it at. I don't think the best point to cut it at is like the very, very beginning of that road. I think I would let it play out a bit longer before that was clear enough to me to have to cut off the conversation. I think you can give ground that like music influences culture, but then use that to feed into your argument about chicken and the egg, right? Because like everybody can agree that music influences culture and influences behavior, but where the question really is like, does the culture influence the music, which then feeds back into the culture? Like, where does the buck stop here? And you can't draw that line, and pointing that out is actually how you get out of that argument. And it would be a better way of stopping it right there than arguing on a point that you actually don't disagree with, right? And recognizing that the audience, and this is the unfortunate thing about some of these like alt sort of arguments, is that the alt arguments are designed to where the everyday man is going to understand them every step of the process, and they're going to agree with it, right? We're going to take a bunch of like beliefs about the world and statements that are like obviously true to most people and are inarguable to most people, and then we're going to build those into like an uglier picture of like the reality of mankind, right? So we're going to say, well, music definitely influences culture, right? And have you seen black people's music? And then you go from there, right? That's what they're trying to do. And that's like, I know that you see that and you're worried about that happening, but like, I don't necessarily think that the person you were talking to was going to do that. And even if they were, the right way of stopping it wouldn't have been to die on the hill that the audience is going to like not agree with you on, but like to point out the problem in the direction he's taking things, that this is a chicken and the egg thing, because then you present like a more interesting problem for both of you to talk about, and something that might be more interesting to the viewers that's immediately obvious to them too, right? Like if you go, well, how do you think those rappers grew up? Like, where do you think they're getting all this from? And like, how do you think the rappers' own personal relationship with the police is? And like, well, there you go. Like, isn't it like the viewer will get that too? Like the same, even for the people that have negative opinions of the rappers, like they can agree that those rappers had those experiences and that those are probably in large part influencing like their musical choices, right? So even the people on the other side can agree with you on that. And then once you point to a different sort of problem presented by this, then you change the whole direction of the conversation. Now it's not about like, well, we should have them change their music because it's negatively influencing their relationship with the police. And if they really wanted to improve that, there's room for them to do it on their side too. Like it gets you out of there and it gets you into like a more interesting argument, and one that hits more on the core of your guys' disagreement. Because especially in that case, we're trying to make some distinction that we never got to between like cultural influence and like implicit bias, and like where one starts and one stops, and how come we label one racism and the other one whatever, and like we get in a bunch of weird territory with like where he's not wanting to connect like culture to like systemic results as because of that culture thing that you're pointing out. My words are all going crazy. Okay. Let's do our show and get out of here. Alrighty.